Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Ibadan woke gently, like a calabash set on still water, and Maria rose before the sky remembered its colors. The cockcrow had barely cleared its throat when she untied the thin scarf covering her hair and listened to the old house breathe. Timbers creaking, roof tin whispering, a restless mouse gnawing somewhere in the wall. Kerosene smoke floated above the single stove like a tired spirit. She fanned it with a broken plate, coaxing the flame as if bargaining with a moody child. Samuel slept across her shoulder blades, strapped with a faded wrapper, warm as fresh puff-puff tucked in cloth, his breath tickling the ridge of her spine. The compound beyond her door coughed to life. Buckets clanged, someone hawked bread. A radio hummed a faint Fuji song that sounded like yesterday's promise trying not to die. She chose silence the way a surgeon chooses a blade, calm, measured, final. Outside, the red sand yard was slick from night dew, and the mango tree behind the pit latrine shook its leaves as if shedding secrets. Maria warmed water with the slow patience of an ant moving a mountain, then rinsed the bowl and spoon with that same patience, as though time were a cloth she could wring clean. When she combed her hair, the teeth snagged on a small knot. She eased it free without wincing, a small rehearsal for bigger untanglings. A neighbor's baby wailed briefly, then hiccuped into quiet, and somewhere a generator coughed like an asthmatic goat before finding its breath. If hope had a smell, it would have been the early perfume of frying akara mingling with wet earth and wood smoke. If fear had a shape, it would have been the shadow that pooled by the bedroom door where John sometimes stood, one shoulder against the frame, half man, half storm. She tied her wrapper tight, checked the knot, checked Samuel's weight, checked the little purse with 2 crisp notes and some tired coins. Everything counted, nothing wasted. The mirror, foxed at the corners, returned a face she recognized but rarely greeted. A woman with night kept under her eyes and dawn hiding in her jaw. People say the road does not reject the feet that visit it. Maria's feet had learned every ridge of the path to the well, every gossip corner by the kiosk, every smile worth keeping. She sipped water, let it rest on her tongue the way a prayer rests before it rises. Breath by careful breath, she arranged her morning like beads on a string, refusing the urge to rush, refusing the temptation to scratch at old scabs. That was how the day always began, not with fanfare, but with small obediences to the body and the clock, the way a drummer tests a skin before he dares the rhythm. And in that hush, she made a promise no one heard. Today she would choose a door that opened forward. John had once been laughter in clean shoes, the kind a mother might bless at first sight. Now he moved like a rumor with legs. Back when harmattan hands were soft and rent was a manageable burden, he wooed her with plans that could water a desert, talked of a barbershop by Dugby, a Kiki hire purchase, a tiny electronics stall near Makola where remotes and USB cables would jump off the table like fish into a waiting net. He promised, and the promises shone like new coins, bright enough to blind a prudent eye. Then the world tilted. A friend introduced a midnight powder with many names, and his laughter soured, curdled, turned into something with corners. Bottles multiplied around his boots the way weeds claim an untended yard. He learned to raise his voice before he learned to pay a debt. The first time he slapped the table, the plates trembled like chicks under a hawk's shadow. He began walking late, returning later, words stacked on his tongue like broken chairs, useful for nothing but noise. When he was sorry, he was syrup. When he was hungry, he was thunder. Maria learned to move around him the way you move around a sleeping dog, soft, careful, ready. She stitched holes in shirts that returned with new holes, scrubbed stains that argued with soap, seasoned soups that rarely reached his better self. Neighbors developed necks that stretched. One woman hissed, another sighed, a third offered a proverb like a bitter cola. When a wall cracks, the lizard finds a home. Maria absorbed the sayings without swallowing the curses. She packed silence around her like cotton around porcelain. Each day she told herself to wait one more market cycle, one more moon, because sometimes miracles arrive late like long-distance buses. But time did not heal, it hardened. The man who called himself head of house knew only how to count insults. He borrowed money using her smile as collateral and returned with smoke for gratitude. The house learned his footsteps the way a river learns a stone. Every approach meant tightening, bracing, hoping the flood would pass without carrying them away. On Sundays he cried and promised fresh starts while sunlight dusted the floor like ground gold. By Wednesday the promises were IOUs even flies refused to land on. There are storms a roof can negotiate, and storms that turn roofs into rumors. This one was the second kind. Somewhere inside the quiet she kept like savings inside a bra, a ledger formed, debits of sleep, credits of survival. Love, once a yam barn, became crumbs under a chair no one remembered to pull out and sweep. The night before the dawn that mattered, rain stalled above Abaddon without falling, as if the clouds had business but lacked transport money. Heat clung to the room like a stubborn tenant. The curtains stuck to the window frame, and then peeled away with a hiss each time the breeze tried to visit. John drifted in, eyes small and glassy, voice already quarrelsome before any quarrel existed. He smelled like a roadside bar had climbed into his shirt and refused to come down. He began with jokes that had more teeth than humor and graduated to complaints as slick as okra. Why was the soup thin? Why did the kerosene finish? Why did the world gather against him like elders at a stubborn boy's naming? Maria listened with that careful stillness carpenters bring to a fragile hinge. Samuel stirred against her back, half waking to a disturbance he could not name, and she swayed instinctively, the old dance of mothers who bargain with sleep. When John's palm met the table, the cup flipped, spilling water that spread across the wood like a rumor, then dripped bead by bead to the floor. He paced, delivered verdicts, recited histories of betrayal in which he starred as injured king and she as careless jester. Somewhere, a rat decided to reveal itself, scrabbling behind the cabinet. The noise gave Maria the small mercy of turning her head, as though seeking a witness. Those who own evening know how to lengthen it. John stretched the hours until they wore thin. When his anger burned out, it left that familiar ash, a pleasuring apology, sugar on a tongue that had just finished biting. He reached for her shoulder. She stepped aside as if dodging a bicycle in a narrow path. In that slender movement, the decision presented itself like dawn lifting a curtain without permission. She washed the floor, wrung the cloth, set the cup upright, tidied the room to its ordinary arrangement. Ritual steadied her hands while her mind mapped an exit as calmly as a river maps a valley. She folded 2 wrappers, tucked the child's spare shirt, secured the small purse, and placed the bundle where a shadow could keep it safe. Before sleep, she counted backwards from market to market, bodega, Oyai gate, anchoring herself in places where money and bargaining and laughter live. You cannot tell a calabash how to float, it is born to it. When her eyes finally closed, they closed on a picture of a road with no rearview mirror and a horizon that did not flinch. Morning entered through the window in strips, laying ribbons of pale gold on the cracked paint like blessings that refused church attendance. Maria woke before her name quickened in anyone's mouth and dressed in movements measured enough to keep the world from rattling. Wrapper around waist, scarf over hair, sandals adjusted until the leather remembered her feet. Samuel grumbled, burrowed, then settled, a soft weight singing a quiet song against her spine. In the corner, the bundle waited without nerves, proof that resolve can be folded and still be sharp. John stirred, turned, mumbled ownerships he could not afford, then sat up with the slow suspicion of a man who knows his dream has a rival. He watched her knot the last tie. "Go now," he said, grinning like a cat that tipped the milk. "You'll be back before the pot boils. A woman without a man is dry season." The sentence tried to bait her into flinching. She watered the plant instead. No thunder rolled. No drum announced the moment. Only the ordinary choir of morning, bread seller calling a jeej, tires whispering on wet sand, a radio blessing someone's hustle in cool Yoruba vowels. Maria opened the door and stepped into the yard, where the mango tree shook an approving leaf and the sky stretched, almost surprised by its own size. She did not check the window for his watching eyes. She did not count the gates between the room and the road. When the compound's iron gate groaned, it sounded like a witness signing a document. She walked past neighbors who were busy not noticing, past a child plucking flowers to cook as pretend soup, past a woman beating a mat with a stick until dust confessed. At the junction she paused, not for doubt but for direction, the way a hunter in tall grass listens for the road breathing. The city opened its palms, bodega in one hand, Dugby in the other, the future humming somewhere between. She chose with the discernment of someone who has eaten salt and survived thirst. Behind her, a door existed, but it no longer contained a home. Before her, 1,000 small doors would require patient knocking. Forward, she told her feet, and they obeyed. The sun, late to work as always, climbed its ladder. A danfo screeched to a halt, and then changed its mind. A hawker lifted a tray and parted traffic with hips that understood negotiation. Maria felt fear trying to borrow her breath and handed it a small courage instead. If anyone asked, she would say only that a woman had gone to fetch water from a new well. She did not look back. Maria stepped into Abaddon's morning bustle as though stepping into a sea that refused to part, her wrapper swaying with the rhythm of countless footsteps, voices colliding like restless waves, the smell of roasted corn and fried bean cake clinging to the air. The market women were already in full command of the street, their voices sharp, carrying across stalls as if competing with the clamor of danfos honking impatiently, conductors shouting destinations that tangled in the wind. Dugby! Dugby straight! Bodija! Bodija! Life in the city did not wait for anyone to gather their breath. It pulled you in and forced you to swim or sink. Maria adjusted Samuel's weight on her back, his small hands curled against her shoulder, his head nodding with drowsy trust that she would keep him safe. She threaded her way between wheelbarrows stacked with yam and traders balancing trays on their heads, her pace steady, unhurried, her heart beating with a quiet urgency that no one around her could guess. Each step forward was not merely movement but declaration. She had left behind the ashes of yesterday, and though fear sat like a pebble in her shoe, she refused to pause and shake it out. She reached a corner where an old woman sold cola nuts and pepper, and there she lingered, pretending to study the goods while her mind worked like a tailor piecing together cloth from scraps. Money was thin. Her small purse carried only enough to last the day, and yet she could not afford despair because despair was a luxury that made people lazy. The old woman's eyes studied her face too long, as if recognizing a secret carried in silence, and Maria offered a smile that did not quite meet her eyes. She moved on, pulled by the hum of the marketplace that promised survival to those willing to bend their backs without complaint. She found herself at a row of vegetables, carefully arranging the few she could afford to resell later. Okra, peppers, some bunches of leafy greens. She negotiated quietly, her voice soft but firm, her words chosen with the care of a woman who could not afford to lose a single coin. In this dance of bargaining, Maria discovered something about herself. Her tongue could be both gentle and sharp, her patience both shield and weapon. She walked away with her goods in a frayed sack, her spine straight despite the weight, her steps matching the rhythm of the city's pulse. A boy passed with a tray of oranges balanced on his head, his voice calling like a bell, and Maria's eyes followed him, not for the fruit, but for the strange confidence in his stride. It struck her then that confidence was a garment no one gave you. You stitched it yourself from persistence and hope. As she moved further along the road, she felt the beginning of that garment forming, thread by invisible thread, even if it was still too thin to keep out the cold. By afternoon the sun had grown proud and merciless, spreading its heat like a boast, the tar of the road shimmering as though it were about to melt. Maria had managed to sell some of her vegetables, the coins clinking softly in her purse like a timid song, far from wealth but enough to promise tomorrow. She found a patch of shade beside a kiosk where sachet water was sold, and there she allowed herself a moment to rest, her back against the wall, Samuel now awake and tugging gently at the edge of her wrapper. His eyes were curious, drinking in the world without fear, as if to remind her that innocence could survive even in noise and chaos. Maria bought him a small piece of bread with part of her earnings, tearing it carefully into tiny bits, each piece like a treasure placed into his eager hand. She watched him chew with the concentration of a child discovering joy, and the sight lit a spark in her chest that pushed back the exhaustion pressing on her bones. Around her, life carried on in relentless rhythm. Hawkers shouting, men debating the price of fuel, schoolchildren running with satchels slung low, their laughter darting through the air like swallows. Maria felt both invisible and tethered, a single thread in a vast cloth woven by the city's hands. But she knew invisibility could be a gift. It allowed her to listen, to observe, to learn. It was in that hour of stillness that Madame Eliza appeared, as though stepping out of the heat itself. She was dressed in ankara that glimmered with bold patterns, her geli towering like a crown, her gold earrings catching the sunlight in small explosions. She stopped at the kiosk to purchase water, her voice smooth yet commanding, the kind that made people turn without knowing why. Maria recognized her at once. She had seen her many times in Bodija Market, moving with the authority of a woman who had wrestled fortune into submission. Eliza's eyes flicked across the crowd, and then settled on Maria, not with idle curiosity, but with interest, as though she saw a story written on Maria's face that no one else had noticed. She asked for vegetables, and Maria offered what remained from her sack, arranging them with trembling hands, embarrassed by how little she had left. Eliza studied both the vegetables and the woman selling them, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then, with a faint smile, Eliza said something simple. "You have neatness in your hands." It was a small sentence, but it carried weight, as though announcing a doorway that Maria had not seen before. Maria did not know what to reply, so she simply bowed her head slightly, her cheeks warming under Eliza's gaze. The older woman handed her the money, more than the vegetables were worth, and added in a softer tone, "You should not be wasting in the sun like this. Come and see me tomorrow. Ask anyone for Madame Eliza's shop by the new park." She pressed a neat card into Maria's hand, the edges crisp, the letters bold, and then turned to leave as swiftly as she had appeared. Maria stared at the card as though it were a piece of gold. She dared not touch too much, afraid it might vanish if rubbed too hard. Around her the market continued its chorus, unaware that something quiet but powerful had shifted. She tucked the card into the inner fold of her wrapper, close to her skin, where it could not be stolen or lost. That night, back in the single room she rented from a widow in another part of the city, Maria lay awake long after Samuel had drifted to sleep, the card heavy in her thoughts. She waited as if it were not paper but destiny, asking herself whether she could trust it, whether stepping toward it would lead to survival or betrayal. Her mind conjured John's mocking smile, the words he had thrown like stones. "You'll come crawling back." Yet in the silence, she understood that crawling back was no longer an option. The road ahead might be rough as gravel, but at least it was hers to choose. She whispered a prayer with no rehearsed words, only breath and longing, then slipped the card beneath her pillow as though planting a seed in secret soil. Sleep came late, but when it did, it carried dreams not of escape but of beginnings. The following morning dawned with a restlessness that clung to Maria like unseen fingers tugging at her arms, urging her forward. She dressed with unusual care, smoothing her wrapper twice, adjusting her scarf until it sat firmly, tying Samuel to her back with a precision that felt like ritual. Her feet carried her along the familiar road, but this time each step felt tethered to an invisible promise. The city stirred with its ordinary chaos, traders setting up stalls, buses groaning under weight, men pushing carts with the strength of oxen, children darting in and out of doorways like birds released from cages. Maria listened to the rhythm of it all, feeling herself a part of the grand, messy symphony rather than an outsider. She asked twice for directions, and both times the name Madame Eliza sparked immediate recognition, the way a spark finds dry grass. Finally she reached a building painted in fading cream, its front shaded by a large umbrella, and there she saw the woman herself, already busy issuing instructions to apprentices who hurried about like bees around a hive. Maria hesitated at the edge of the crowd, nerves curling around her like vines, until Eliza's sharp eyes found her. Without hesitation, Eliza beckoned her forward with a flick of the wrist, as though Maria were expected, as though she had been anticipated. Maria's knees trembled as she stepped into the space, aware of whispers brushing her ears, strangers glancing, and then dismissing her. Eliza smiled briefly, a smile that carried neither softness nor cruelty but certainty, and said, "So you came." It was not a question but an acknowledgement, as if Maria had passed a test merely by arriving. Samuel shifted on her back, restless, and Maria hushed him with a gentle pat. Eliza led her inside, where bolts of fabric lined the walls, shelves stacked with goods gleamed under fluorescent light, and the smell of wealth and labor intermingled. She gestured to a chair, her voice calm yet firm. "Sit. Let us talk." In that moment Maria realized that she was not merely being offered kindness, she was being invited into a story that might rewrite her own. The weeks that followed unfolded like cloth unrolled from a loom, each day weaving itself into a new pattern that Maria could hardly recognize as her own life. Madame Eliza introduced her slowly to the inner workings of her trade, beginning with small tasks that seemed ordinary but were laced with lessons for sharper eyes. Maria was asked to sweep the front of the shop each morning before the apprentices arrived, not because the floor truly needed her broom, but because Eliza wanted to see if she would treat the business as though it were her own. She did not sweep carelessly. She swept as though each speck of dust carried meaning, as though the broom were her tongue and the floor her reputation. Apprentices who had laughed behind her back grew silent when they saw how her hands turned chores into statements of purpose. Within days she was entrusted with organizing stock, noting down which fabrics sold quickest, which stayed too long on the shelves, which customers bargained hardest but returned faithfully. She paid attention the way thirsty earth drinks rain, quietly, deeply, holding nothing back. At night, after the shop closed, she carried Samuel home on her back, his head heavy with sleep, and as she walked the streets she would rehearse numbers in her mind, memorizing what bolts of Ankara had been sold and how much was left in the ledger. The rhythm of trade began to sing inside her, louder than fear, more convincing than John's long-ago mockery. When Eliza tested her with questions, which pattern moved fastest last week? How many yards are left of the blue and gold Ankara? Maria answered with accuracy that startled even herself. Eliza's smile in those moments was like a lantern held briefly in darkness, brief, controlled, but enough to show the road ahead. Slowly Maria's purse began to carry more weight, her meals stretched further, and Samuel's shoes no longer pinched his toes. She discovered that survival was not a sprint, but a patient walk, and with every measured step she was beginning to cross the wide river between who she had been and who she was becoming. But prosperity does not arrive like rain without thunderclouds, and Maria soon discovered that every rising sun casts shadows. Some of the apprentices grew jealous of her quick rise, whispering that she had charmed Madame Eliza, that perhaps she used secrets of the night to climb so swiftly. In markets where gossip flew faster than mosquitoes, rumors grew legs and ran without invitation. One evening, while arranging fabrics, she overheard two young women muttering about her in Yoruba, calling her age, under their breath, a witch who bent fortune with hidden strings. Maria swallowed the insult without reply, her hands folding cloth more carefully than ever, but her heart carried the sting long after the words had passed. She knew silence could be shield and weapon, yet sometimes silence also burned like pepper rubbed on tender skin. That night she lay awake, listening to Samuel's soft breathing, reminding herself that every tree that grows tall attracts wind. Eliza noticed the shift in her spirit, for nothing escaped the older woman's sharp eyes. The next morning she pulled Maria aside, her voice low but firm. "Let them talk. A river does not stop flowing because frogs make noise at its bank. Do your work. Let your results answer them." Those words lodged in Maria's bones like nails hammered deep into wood. She stopped explaining herself, stopped defending against shadows, and poured her energy into learning more. Soon Eliza allowed her to negotiate with customers directly, trusting her with sales that carried large sums. The first time Maria closed a deal worth far more than her month's wages, her hands trembled slightly as she counted the notes, but her voice remained steady, her eyes clear. The customer left satisfied, and Eliza simply nodded, as though confirming what she already knew, that Maria was no ordinary woman. The jealous whispers did not stop, but they began to sound smaller, fainter, like flies buzzing around an elephant that continues its journey regardless. Maria learned then that power was not always loud or obvious. Sometimes power was simply consistency that refused to falter. As months turned into a full year, Maria's life began to carry a rhythm she had once thought belonged only to others. Her mornings started early, but not with dread. She looked forward to the work, to the feel of fabric under her fingers, to the steady hum of customers moving in and out, to the numbers that lined up in the ledger like soldiers obeying command. Samuel grew into a lively boy with bright eyes, already learning to count change and greet customers with a politeness that charmed them. He often played at the back of the shop, arranging scraps of cloth into patterns, his laughter spilling into the air like bells that softened even the hardest bargaining. Maria found herself smiling more often, sometimes without realizing it, the corners of her mouth remembering joy. She began to save not just coins but real notes, folding them into a small box she kept hidden, each one a brick laid in the foundation of the future she dreamed. On Sundays, she no longer hid indoors to escape shame. She walked confidently to church with Samuel beside her, dressed modestly but neatly, holding her head high. Neighbors who once pitied her now nodded respectfully, some even asking her for small loans, their voices coated with sudden sweetness. She lent sparingly, careful not to drain herself for others' comfort, but she noticed how quickly people's tongues turned when fortune shifted. What struck her most was not the change in their behavior, but the change in her heart. She no longer carried the same ache that had once defined her. Pain had not vanished, but it had been replaced by strength, a strength quiet yet undeniable, the kind that is not worn like jewelry but carried like marrow and bone. She realized she had become someone John would not recognize, a woman who did not beg for crumbs but learned to bake her own bread. Yet even as Maria's path brightened, shadows from her past still trailed her steps, sometimes appearing at unexpected corners. On a humid evening when rain threatened, but did not fall, She passed by a street near Makola, where a group of men sat drinking. Their laughter was loud, thick with intoxication, and for a moment she thought she recognized a voice among them, deep, familiar, tinged with arrogance that had once been her prison. She quickened her pace, clutching Samuel's small hand, her heart knocking against her ribs like a drum in frenzy. She did not look back to confirm, for looking back had never served her well. But the echo of that voice lingered all the way home, reminding her that Abaddon was vast yet small, and some histories refused to stay buried. That night, she prayed not for John's downfall but for distance, for the chance to continue her rise without the shadow of his ruin dragging across her road. She knew fate often tests the strong not by removing obstacles, but by placing old ghosts in their path to see if they will stumble. As she blew out the lantern and lay beside Samuel, who was already asleep, she whispered to herself, "I did not come this far to be afraid of echoes." The wind rattled the window gently, carrying with it the sounds of the restless city, and Maria closed her eyes with the certainty that the future was still calling her name, louder than any ghost from the past. John's days after Maria's departure unfolded like the pages of a book soaked in rain, blurred, smudged, and without coherence. At first, he strutted through Makola's winding streets as if nothing had changed, telling whoever cared to listen that his wife had run off but would soon return, dragging her pride behind her like a wounded animal. He spoke loudly in beer parlors, slapping tables with exaggerated confidence, his voice heavy with bravado that even he did not believe. Men laughed along, partly out of habit, partly out of fear that his crumbling dignity might shatter fully if they did not supply him with audience. But when the weeks began to roll into months and Maria did not appear, the laughter around him thinned, and whispers of pity crept in like termites through rotting wood. His own friends started to vanish, one by one, each with excuses as thin as paper, until he was left drinking alone at corners where shadows kept him company. The money he once earned from odd jobs and favors slipped through his fingers as though his palms were made of holes. The crack that had once offered him an illusion of strength turned into a chain around his ankles, dragging him deeper into a pit he could no longer climb out of. His landlord, a man with a patience stretched thin by too many excuses, finally threw him out one hot afternoon when the debt reached beyond forgiveness. Clothes, broken shoes, and one mattress were dumped into the street, a spectacle for neighbors who shook their heads but offered no help. John gathered his belongings with trembling hands, shame burning his skin, his lips muttering curses that carried no weight. He moved into a dilapidated building half abandoned by tenants, where cracked walls and leaking roofs became his reluctant companions. The house smelled of mildew and forgotten lives, yet it offered him cover from the rain, and so he claimed it, squatting like a thief in someone else's misfortune. Each morning he woke with a dry throat and an emptiness that even alcohol failed to drown, and each night he lay awake, listening to rats scurry above the ceiling, wondering how a man who once carried dreams had become nothing more than a shadow wandering in circles. Ibadan, with its sprawling chaos, does not pause for a man's downfall. The city continues to beat its drum, inviting only those strong enough to dance. John discovered this truth bitterly as he drifted through the streets, begging for work, hoping for scraps. He became a familiar figure at motor parks, offering to carry loads for a few naira, his hands trembling from withdrawal, his breath sour with defeat. Conductors mocked him, children laughed at his disheveled state, and women pulled their wrappers tighter when he approached. He consoled himself with lies, telling strangers that business had merely gone bad, that fortune would soon smile again. But his eyes betrayed him, hollow and red, the eyes of a man abandoned even by hope. Nights were worst, when the city's noise quieted and silence exposed his thoughts. He replayed Maria's departure over and over, her silence cutting sharper than any words could. He remembered the last time she looked at him, her face calm, her footsteps firm, and it gnawed at him like a persistent itch. For all his bravado, deep inside he knew he had pushed her away, brick by brick, insult by insult, neglect by neglect. Yet pride refused him the honesty of regret, so he buried the truth under bottles and smoke, choking on his own stubbornness. Sometimes he wondered if she truly had found another man, some wealthy suitor who had whisked her away, and the thought burned like fire poured on an open wound. In his worst moments, he cursed her name, but in quieter hours, when loneliness pressed hard against his chest, he found himself whispering it like a prayer, as though the syllables themselves might conjure her back. But prayers uttered from dirty lips seldom travel far, and Maria remained as distant as the stars above his leaking roof. The years carved themselves into John's body with a merciless hand. His once proud shoulders stooped, his skin sagged, his clothes became little more than rags. Hunger marked his cheeks with sharp lines, and his laughter, when it came at all, was hollow, echoing against walls that did not care. The crack that had promised escape now tightened its grip until he was little more than a puppet jerked by invisible strings. His few remaining friends abandoned him completely when debt collectors began to sniff around, leaving him to face his shame alone. The dilapidated house he squatted in was eventually put up for sale by its owner, who had grown weary of maintaining property that yielded no profit. Rumors spread that a wealthy buyer had shown interest, someone who intended to renovate and breathe new life into the crumbling structure. John ignored the whispers at first, convinced that fortune would somehow turn, and the building would remain his refuge. But deep inside, a knot of fear tightened in his belly, the kind that comes when a man knows the ground beneath him is about to shift. He tried to bargain with the caretaker, offering empty promises of rent to come, but his words carried no weight. Promises made by empty pockets are like drums with no skin, they make no sound. As the days dragged on, the reality became clearer. He was about to lose even the fragile shelter that misery had allowed him. The thought gnawed at him endlessly, and he began to wander the rooms at night like a ghost, running his fingers over cracked walls as though touching them could anchor him to the place. Sleep abandoned him, and in its place came visions of Maria, sometimes angry, sometimes forgiving, sometimes distant, always beyond reach. He did not know where she was or what had become of her, but he could not shake the thought that she was somewhere better, living a life he had once promised but never delivered. It was on one such restless night that fate, always a patient collector of debts, prepared its cruelest twist. John lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, when the caretaker's knock echoed through the hollow house, firm and final. The owner had sold the building, he was told, and the new landlord would soon take possession. John begged, pleaded, tried to summon the arrogance that had once carried him, but his words fell like stones into an empty well. He wandered the rooms in disbelief, his hands shaking, his chest tight, his world collapsing again, as though the ground itself had chosen to spit him out. He tried to imagine who this new landlord was, what kind of person would hold his fate in their hands, and dread coiled around his thoughts like a python around its prey. Days later, when he heard footsteps approaching and the metallic rattle of keys against the gate, he braced himself, expecting some stern-faced man eager to throw him out. He did not know, could not know, that the figure about to step into the house was no stranger, no distant landlord, but Maria herself, the woman he had dismissed, broken, and lost. In that instant, without yet seeing her, the air in the house thickened, as though the walls themselves knew that history was about to fold back on itself in a way neither man nor woman could have imagined. The morning of reckoning arrived without fanfare, as many turning points in life often do. The sun rose over Abaddon with its usual stubborn brilliance, pouring gold over rusted zinc roofs and cracked pavements, waking the city with rooster cries, honking danfos, and the smell of frying akra. John had woken restless, his stomach gnawed hollow, his body trembling from too little food and too much dependency. He sat hunched by the doorway of the crumbling building, scratching at his chin, watching passers-by whose feet seemed to march to a rhythm he no longer understood. Children ran to school with satchels bouncing on their backs, traders shouted their goods with booming confidence, and motorbikes zipped past, spraying dust into the air. Life was moving forward without him, and he was a stone left behind in the middle of the road, kicked now and then by chance. His thoughts chased themselves in endless circles. Who was this new landlord? Would he be thrown out instantly? Could he beg for time? Each answer that came was bleak, each possibility darker than the last. He muttered bitterly under his breath, cursing unseen enemies, blaming fate, blaming the government, blaming anyone but himself. But when silence fell again, his heart whispered the truth he hated most, that he was the architect of his own downfall. Just as despair began to pull him under like quicksand, he heard footsteps approaching the gate, steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority. The metallic clink of keys followed, sharp as a bell in the morning air. John's heart stuttered. He pulled himself to his feet, wiping his palms against his trousers, trying to summon what little dignity remained. He expected a man, stern, unsmiling, with papers in hand and threats on his lips. But when the gate creaked open, what stepped through was not a man at all, but a woman whose presence seemed to bend the air around her. She was dressed neatly, her galley modest yet firm, her wrapper tied with the precision of one who knew her worth. At her side stood a boy, tall now, his face holding the echoes of a child John once knew. For a heartbeat John thought his eyes deceived him, but the longer he stared, the clearer the truth became. It was Maria. The sight of her struck him harder than any slap, harder than the hunger in his belly or the ache in his bones. She did not look like the woman he remembered, the weary, beaten wife with hollow eyes and patched clothes. No, this Maria stood straight, her gaze calm and steady, her skin glowing with quiet confidence. Prosperity clung to her not in gaudy jewels or loud display, but in the firmness of her stance, in the certainty of her steps. The boy beside her, Samuel, their son, had grown tall, his eyes sharp, his clothes neat, his posture reflecting the care and discipline of a mother who had refused to let life ruin her child. John's lips parted, but no words came. He stared, stunned, as though ghosts had materialized before him. Maria's gaze swept the compound, deliberate, assessing, before it landed on him. Her eyes, once filled with pleading and pain, now held a depth that was unreadable, a mixture of distance and quiet triumph. She did not rush to speak, and the silence stretched between them like a taut rope. John's heart pounded, shame rising hot in his chest, choking him more than hunger ever could. He staggered forward, his knees weak, his voice trembling as it finally broke free. "Maria," he whispered, her name tasting strange in his mouth after so many years. "Maria, you came back." He tried to smile, but the effort twisted his face into something pitiful. His knees buckled, and before he knew it, he was kneeling in the dust, reaching for her as if she were water in the desert. He muttered apologies, half-formed, desperate, pouring from him like a broken calabash spilling what little it contained. Maria listened in silence, her face unreadable. Inside her chest, her heart stirred with memories. Memories of nights when tears soaked her pillow, of mornings when Samuel's hungry cries broke her spirit, of days when John's insults pierced her deeper than any blade. She remembered how she had left, Samuel strapped to her back, walking without looking behind her, carrying nothing but hope and determination. She remembered the struggles, the market days, the hunger, the long climb toward stability, the hand that Madame Eliza had extended, the opportunities she had seized with both hands. All of that now stood between her and the man kneeling before her like a river swollen with years of rain. She felt no hatred, no satisfaction, no gloating, only a deep, steady calm. She shifted the keys in her hand, their metallic jingle sharp in the quiet compound, a sound that seemed to echo her authority. Samuel, standing beside her, watched the scene with wide eyes, his young mind trying to reconcile the image of this broken man with the fragments of memory he carried of a father who once seemed tall. Maria finally spoke, her voice measured, low, but carrying the weight of unshakable resolve. "I did not come back, John," she said. "I came forward. This house is mine now. I am not your wife. I am the landlord." The words fell like stones into the silence, heavy, undeniable. John flinched as though struck, his tears spilling freely, his hands clawing at the ground. "Maria, please," he begged, his voice raw, cracking under the weight of desperation. "Don't leave me like this. I have nothing. Forgive me. Take me back." But Maria's gaze did not soften. Her silence carried more weight than his pleas. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes not cruel but firm, then turned to Samuel and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. The boy leaned into her touch, his face calm, steady, as though her strength flowed directly into him. Maria took a slow breath, her eyes lifting briefly to the sky where the late sun painted streaks of red and gold. Then she looked back at John, her voice soft but final. "You had your chance," she said. "I carried firewood with you, but you added thorns. Now I carry keys, and they are not for you." She pulled Samuel close and walked past John, the rustle of her wrapper sounding louder than his sobs. The gate closed behind her with a metallic finality, the clang of iron sealing what words could not. John remained on his knees, dust clinging to his trousers, his cries echoing in the empty compound. Neighbors peered from behind doors and windows, whispering, some shaking their heads, others nodding knowingly. But Maria did not look back. She walked forward, her son beside her, her steps steady, her heart free. For her, this was not revenge, not triumph, but closure. The chapter of suffering was behind her, and ahead stretched the road she had chosen for herself, a road where dignity walked beside her like a faithful companion. The compound grew strangely quiet after Maria and Samuel walked out, their figures swallowed by the dust and the orange light of evening. John remained on his knees long after their departure, the silence around him so complete it pressed on his ears like a burden. The gate's metallic clang replayed in his mind, each echo louder than the last, until it seemed the iron itself had declared him abandoned. He looked down at his hands, dusty, trembling, the lines in his palms etched deep, as though years of wasted time had carved rivers into his skin. Neighbors whispered from their doorways, some with pity, others with thinly veiled satisfaction, but none came to comfort him. Shame sat heavy on his shoulders, heavier than hunger, heavier than any debt. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had lost. Not just a woman, not just a child, but the life he could have had if he had chosen differently. He tried to stand, but his knees resisted, stiff from too long in the dust, so he remained where he was, staring at the ground as though it held answers. He replayed memories in broken fragments. Maria laughing softly the first time she cooked for him, Samuel toddling barefoot in the compound, evenings when promises still hung in the air like sweet smoke. But those memories felt like dreams from another life, unreachable, taunting him with what might have been. For years he had cursed fate, cursed poverty, cursed the world, but now he realized the enemy had always been within. His choices had built this ruin brick by brick, and Maria's silence was only the final mirror reflecting it back to him. He lowered his head, his tears falling into the dust, and for the first time they were not cries for pity, but cries of recognition, cries of a man who had finally met himself in the ruins of his pride. Maria, meanwhile, walked steadily down the road with Samuel beside her, the keys still clutched in her hand, their metallic weight a reminder of how far she had come. She did not look back, not once, though the sound of John's cries drifted faintly behind her like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel's small hand fit into hers, warm and firm, and she squeezed it gently, knowing he too had felt the gravity of that moment. The boy glanced up at her, curiosity and confusion mingling in his eyes, but he did not speak. He was learning, even at his age, that some truths are too heavy for words, that silence itself can be a teacher. They reached the roadside where traders were beginning to pack up for the night, their voices still lively, haggling over the last sales of the day. Life in Abadan moved forward without pause, unconcerned with the dramas of individuals. A woman sold roasted plantain under a flickering lantern. A child tugged at his mother's wrapper. A Danfo conductor shouted, "Gate! Gate straight!" And for Maria, this ordinary noise was a balm, proof that the world continued to spin no matter how much pain tried to anchor it. She led Samuel into a small buka, ordered them a modest meal of rice and stew, and as they ate, she felt a wave of calm settle over her. It was not joy, not triumph, but peace, the peace of one who had fought battles and refused to be broken. She watched Samuel eat eagerly, his face lit by the lantern's glow, and thought of the road still ahead, his schooling, their future, the responsibilities that would never end. But she no longer feared the journey. She had keys in her hands now, not just to the house she owned, but to her destiny. In the weeks that followed, Maria settled fully into her new role as landlord. Tenants came and went, renovations began, workers hammered and painted, and the once dilapidated building began to take shape under her direction. She moved with quiet authority, her voice steady, her instructions clear, and those around her respected her not because of titles or loudness, but because her presence demanded it. Samuel helped where he could, fetching nails for carpenters, running errands for masons, his laughter weaving into the sound of hammers and saws. Together, mother and son transformed the house into something alive again, something dignified. Maria visited Madame Eliza often, updating her on progress, sharing laughter, exchanging wisdom. Eliza would shake her head sometimes, marveling at how far Maria had come, telling her, "You are proof that a woman's strength is like water, soft enough to flow, strong enough to break rock." Maria would smile, accepting the words quietly, but deep inside she knew her journey was still unfolding. She carried her past not as a wound, but as a scar, a reminder of the path she had crossed. And though John lingered at the edges of her mind, she no longer carried him as a burden. He was a chapter closed, his cries echoing only as warnings etched into her memory. Each day she rose early, prepared Samuel for school, and returned to oversee the house, her life now steady, purposeful, anchored. She no longer dreamed of survival. She dreamed of growth, of legacy, of planting seeds that would outlive her. As for John, he became a familiar figure of pity, wandering the streets, sometimes seen outside beer parlors, sometimes crouched in the shade of walls, muttering to himself. People shook their heads when they saw him, whispering about the man who had lost everything. Some said he was cursed, others said he had cursed himself, but everyone agreed on one thing: he was a lesson. Once in a while he drifted near the house that had once sheltered him, staring from a distance at its new coat of paint, its repaired roof, its lively tenants. He never approached, never dared to enter, for he knew the keys no longer belonged to him. nor did the woman who carried them. On those days, he would sit at a corner, his head bowed, until hunger or shame pushed him away again. Maria never saw him directly, though sometimes neighbors mentioned his presence in passing. If their words troubled her, she did not show it. She simply nodded, her face calm, her steps unbroken. She had learned that life does not wait for anyone to catch up. The path of regret is long, but it leads nowhere. The path of resilience, though hard, always leads forward. And so Maria continued forward, Samuel beside her, the sound of the city in her ears, the keys firm in her hand. The past was behind her, the future ahead, and for the first time in her life, she walked without fear, without shame, without hesitation. She never looked back. You have heard the story of Maria, the woman who refused to look back. In this life, do not let anyone's weakness become your prison. Carry your cross with courage and remember, when one road ends, another begins. Just like Maria, may you find strength where people thought you would fall, and may your silence one day speak louder than the noise of those who mocked you. May your tears never be wasted, but turn into rivers of joy. May helpers locate you in your lowest moment, and may doors of favor open wide for you. May your children be a source of pride and never a burden of shame. Where others expect you to fail, may you rise with strength and surprise them with victory. Every chain of poverty, delay, or disgrace in your life, may it be broken from this moment. Your tomorrow will be brighter than your yesterday, and peace will never depart from your home. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.